Hello, my friends. Welcome to tonight's story. And as always, I want to thank you for being here. Whether you are listening in bed with the lights dimmed, or perhaps letting this voice accompany you while you drift toward sleep, I am grateful for your time. If you enjoy calm history, spoken slowly, if you find rest in stories that move without hurry, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you will not miss the next evenings we share together. And also leave me a comment telling me where in the world you are listening from, whether it is night in your city or morning, whether you are in a small village or a great capital. I love to imagine how these words travel across oceans and mountains to reach you. Now let us begin, slowly, carefully, with the life of one of the darkest figures of the 20th century, Adolf Hitler, a name that carries with it enormous weight, not of greatness, but of destruction. And yet, to understand history, we must move calmly through his biography, seeing not only the rise but also the collapse. The path from childhood to the ruin of a continent. He was born on the 20th of April in the year 1889 in a small town called Braunau am Inn, on the border of Austria and Germany. The son of Alois Hitler and Clara Pelzel, a child in a provincial household. A boy who would grow up surrounded by both strict discipline and tender care. For his father was harsh, a customs official who demanded obedience, while his mother was gentle, protective, devoted, and these contrasts shaped the young Adolf's early years, filling him with both resentment and longing, a mixture that would echo later in his speeches and visions. He attended school without distinction, often in conflict with teachers. Restless, drawn to grand ideas of German pride, yet weak in discipline. He dreamed of becoming an artist. He longed for recognition. He sketched, he painted. He applied twice to the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna, and twice he was rejected. His hopes of becoming a painter dashed. His sense of grievance growing in Vienna. He lived in poverty, drifting between hostels, earning little from odd jobs, reading extensively, and slowly absorbing ideas of nationalism and anti-Semitism that were spreading in the early 20th century. He was fascinated by architecture. He admired operas of Wagner. He resented the multicultural empire of Austria-Hungary, and he began to imagine a pure German nation. His views hardened, his resentments deepened, and yet still he remained an obscure figure. No one could have guessed that this struggling young man would one day plunge the world into war. When the First World War erupted in 1914, he volunteered for the German army, serving as a messenger on the Western Front. Experiencing the trenches, the gas, the endless mud of battles, he was wounded, decorated for bravery, and when Germany lost the war in 1918, when the Treaty of Versailles imposed harsh terms, Hitler was among those who felt humiliated, betrayed, convinced that Germany had been stabbed in the back, and this myth of betrayal became central to his future politics. After the war, he remained in Munich, still directionless, but soon drawn into nationalist circles. He joined the German Workers' Party, a small radical group, and quickly his talent for oratory made him its most visible member. He could speak with passion. He could ignite anger. He could transform resentments into slogans. And by 1920, the party renamed itself the National Socialist German Workers' Party. The Nazis, with Hitler at its center, their symbol the swastika, their rhetoric one of unity, revenge, and purity. In 1923, they attempted a coup, the Beer Hall Putsch, marching through Munich, hoping to seize power. But they failed. Hitler was arrested, tried for treason, and imprisoned. It was during his months in prison that he dictated his book Mein Kampf, outlining his ideology, his hatred of Jews, his belief in Lebensraum, living space for the German people, his vision of an empire built on conquest. The book became the blueprint for what was to come. When he was released, he found a Germany struggling with economic crisis, hyperinflation, unemployment, and into this chaos, his message began to resonate. He built the party into a movement. He organized rallies, parades, propaganda campaigns. He spoke of restoring pride, of reversing Versailles, of purging enemies. And though in the 1920s his influence was limited, the Great Depression of 1929 gave him new strength. As millions lost jobs, as despair spread, Hitler promised renewal, he promised jobs, he promised greatness, and in 1933, through elections and political deals, he was appointed Chancellor, the head of government, soon consolidating power, abolishing democracy, transforming Germany into a dictatorship, the Third Reich, and from that moment, history bent toward catastrophe. When Adolf Hitler secured the office of Chancellor in January of 1933, Germany was a fragile state. A country, worn down by hardship and public discouragement, searched for direction. Into that emptiness, a single voice arrived, promising order and certainty while hinting at threats from vague external others. Authority tightened quickly. An incident at the National Assembly became the pretext for emergency rules. Civil protections were set aside, independent papers fell quiet, opponents were removed from public life. Soon, a sweeping statute allowed rule by decree under the appearance of legality, and a fragile civic system bent into a centralized order. Structures for control expanded, rival parties dissolved, worker organizations were folded into state frameworks, a single movement dominated. New security bodies enforced loyalty and discouraged dissent. Exclusionary rules turned categories of people into outsiders. Professional doors closed, licenses were withdrawn, marriages were restricted. Meanwhile, grand gatherings and carefully staged spectacles filled the public square with lights, banners, and rehearsed unity pageantry that soothed the crowds and muffled what was happening elsewhere. Visible recovery won support. Public works began, new projects appeared, factories restarted, and joblessness seemed to fall. People saw roads being built, new products promised, uniforms marching in perfect lines. Yet underneath it all, this revival leaned on rearmament and on a plan that looked past the horizon. The aim was not stable peace, but outward pressure and expansion. Agreements that once limited action were tested, then ignored. Neighboring regions were absorbed. Pledges were broken, and the region slid from uncertainty toward crisis. Inside the country, everyday life was reshaped. Radios, posters, schoolbooks, and parades all pointed in one direction. Art and music were recast to praise the state. Instruction for the young emphasized conformity over curiosity. Those who did not fit the model learned to become invisible. Those who spoke too plainly learned to fall silent. A society that had been noisy with argument became quiet with permission. The machine moved outward with speed. Borders shifted under pressure. Capitals changed hands. Flags were lowered and raised again. Triumphal broadcasts filled the air. But behind the broadcasts lay closures and controls. In the far east of the map, a vast campaign unfolded, larger than anything the region had seen. Towns emptied, supply lines snapped, and winter and hunger did their slow work. Behind the lines, special formations followed, tasked with the darkest missions. Entire communities disappeared from registers and maps, their absence explained in euphemisms and paperwork. Later generations would search the record and find only numbers. What began as a promise of stability hardened into a system that asked people to trade truth for spectacle, independence for order, neighbors for targets, and law for decrees. The same pattern repeated in every chapter. A problem announced, an emergency declared, a freedom set aside only for now, and a celebration staged to mark the supposed solution. If you listen closely beneath the speeches of that era, you can hear the quiet steps by which a republic drifts away from itself. First the emergency, then the exceptional measure, then the normalization, then the memory that it was ever different begins to fade. In time, even kind people learn to look away. They do not cheer harm, they simply do not see it in the script they have been given. Tonight, as your breath slows and your shoulders soften, let the lesson rest gently. Be wary of voices that ask for unlimited permission, of leaders who define belonging by exclusion, of celebrations that drown out questions. Healthy public life is loud with accountability and bright with ordinary light. When a system prefers darkness and silence, it is not protecting you, it is protecting itself. In a city of lanterns, there was a long season of tiredness. People walked more softly than before. Workshops worked in fits and starts. Squares emptied early. Then, at a crossroads, a single voice appeared clear, steady, confident. It promised order in straight roads. It pointed toward the haze and said the haze was the problem. Many felt lighter simply because someone sounded sure. Soon a small spark flickered in the council hall. Perhaps a candle fell. Perhaps a paper caught. It was called a sign of danger, and an exceptional night was announced. Watchmen stood at corners. New notices appeared on the walls. Newspapers went quiet until things cleared up. A few familiar voices vanished from the posters, with assurances they would return after review. A great parchment of permissions followed. Rules could now be written with one hand, citing safety and calm. Old arguments came to seem like needless noise. The streets took on a single pattern. Craft guilds were folded into central workshops to keep time together. Many offices with neat badges were created to keep the city in step. Circles were painted on certain doors. Lists explained who could enter where, and what was not yet appropriate. Talk of friendship and marriage became matters for clerks. In the wide squares came festivals of light. Flags, garlands, choirs, synchronized steps, everything looked whole and grand, as if the city had found one shared rhythm. Celebration made it easier not to hear what happened in the side streets, where the new rules knocked on shutters. The economy seemed to wake. Roads were laid, bridges raised, steam whistled again. City plans promised people's products that soon everyone would own. Yet an invisible spring beneath it all was tuned for marching. Workshops obeyed timetables, and timetables obeyed routes that kept reaching toward the edge of the map. Agreements that once bound the city to its neighbors became temporary. Lines on the plan were first adjusted, then redrawn. Where yesterday a marker said, "Limit," a shield now read "Hours." Inside the city, life was smoothed to a single tempo. Posters, bulletins, and schoolbooks repeated the same phrases. The arts were trimmed to a single pattern. Curiosity was replaced by correct diligence. Columns moved and moved until they reached places where the map was larger than the city and winter thicker than the walls. Roads stretched, supply carts thinned, roadside lamps were doused before water could boil. Behind the columns came other brigades silent, carrying tidy ledgers. In some census books, names turned into numbers and then disappeared from the register. Paper called this transfer. Silence called it something else, but not aloud. New forces joined the circle, distant, heavy, with different ways of counting and supplying. Month by month it became clear. Slogans alone could not carry such weight. Trumpets still sounded from high windows, but on the paving stones one could hear the footfall of weariness. The turn arrived quietly. A window labeled "Invincible" cracked. Seams crept across the facade. Little gardens of resistance, once tucked behind courtyards, grew wider. On the edges, workshops that had stood silent began to hum. The air filled with a low noise the garlands could no longer cover. In reply, arrows were redrawn on maps, and standing orders demanded people hold ground where even stone could not. Saying no was not allowed, even as the earth beneath changed color. The city once promised everlasting began to shed plaster. Roads from many directions reached toward it. Messages from the harbors dulled its stained glass. Power was kept not by ceremony but by fear of losing control. The call went out to the very young and the very old. Hopes were pinned on marvelous mechanisms that would soon reverse everything. No marvel arrived. Only the bill did long, cold, with blank spaces where names should be. Meanwhile, the darkest machine built quietly, apart from the rest, tightened its work. Caravans moved toward places left blank on maps but carefully gridded in ledgers. Even when the city's wheels squeaked with fatigue, there were still hands, hours, and rails for this machine. That detail revealed the plan. It was never only about roads and facades. It was about erasing those declared unneeded for a narrow idea of us. At last the high office stood empty. Keys to the strong rooms lay on a desk. Maps inked with arrows lost their meaning. The city woke among shattered windows and the dust of old posters. When certain archive boxes were opened, they held not answers, but silence filed by date. A lesson remained quiet as a midnight lamp. Every time one voice asks for temporary special powers, narrows "we" to a bracelet pattern, swaps questions for a parade, and trades daylight for a spotlight, the first to pay are those with the least protection. Later, everyone pays. Healthy civic life is noisy with accountability and bright with ordinary. When the figure at the center finally left the stage, the structure he had built collapsed in on itself. Banners were lowered, emblems unpinned, slogans faded from the walls. The great machine that had promised destiny ended as wreckage, leaving streets of dust and silence where parades had once passed. Told slowly, the story reminds us that the worst chapters of history are not only made of battles, but also of obedience, of quiet crowds, of a long willingness to follow a voice that promised greatness and delivered ruin. In the days that followed, the City of Lanterns yielded. The high offices unlocked their doors, keys gathered on a single desk, courtyards filled with a stunned quiet, the sort that comes when noise stops all at once. What seemed eternal dissolved into ash-colored mornings, and the masks that once looked like destiny were seen as masks after all. Across the thresholds, caretakers from many directions arrived to steady the broken streets. Maps were set on tables. Food lines stretched, scaffolds climbed the ribs of ruined halls, and the work of clearing and mending began. Trains brought people searching for people. Houses stood, but families were scattered across paper like fallen pins. The cost was counted in absences as much as in numbers. Soon, a long table was assembled in a hall of bright lamps. Records were opened. Testimonies were spoken. Ledgers were read line by line. A rule was written there for the world to remember. No cloak, no office, no emblem stands above accountability. The proceedings did not erase grief, but they placed a marker in daylight saying that organized harm is not excused by organized power. For those who lived among the ruins, the aftermath was not only brick and bread, it was the inward labor of memory. A people had to learn how to name what had happened in their name, to face the mirror without turning away, to resist the small comforts of forgetting. This work could not be finished in a season. It would take generations, schools, stories, quiet conversations at kitchen tables before the language of reckoning sounded natural on the tongue. Elsewhere, other iron rooms fell shut. The world exhaled and then held its breath again, counting the price of what had been endured. The lesson that drifted from city to city was simple and hard. Civic life is fragile. A constitution is only as strong as the habits that keep it honest. Fear and flattery can unmake a public in less time than it took to build one. The central figure's absence did not immediately silence the dark machinery he set in motion. As locked places were opened, the scale of what had been done became legible. The empty pages in family books, the ledgers without names, the scheduled trains to nowhere, the paperwork that had pretended to be order while it built erasure. Evidence ended the argument. Daylight ended the euphemisms. In the years that followed, the map was redrawn, and watchmen were appointed, borders tended, charters rewritten. Yet the heaviest border was inside the heart, between what one wishes to have been true and what the record said. Some tried to live on the safer side of that line. Others crossed it and stayed, choosing the difficulty of memory over the sleep of forgetting. The global chorus called this a victory, but it was a bittersweet one. It had taken immeasurable loss to reach a quiet street again. The warning embedded in that quiet says, when a voice asks for exceptions only for now, narrows "we" to a pattern on a sleeve, and trades questions for spectacle, the most vulnerable pay first and then, by degrees, everyone pays. The collapse at the end was not a surprise to history. It was written into the method from the start. And so the story closes, not with trumpets, but with the lamp being lit on a small table. The lesson is humble. Keep the doors of record open. Keep the habit of questions alive. Do not let uniforms replace arguments, or pageantry replace proof. If a generation must choose between a soothing story and a true one, may it choose the slower comfort of truth. Breathe in, breathe out. Imagine a row of lanterns rekindled, one by one, not by order, but by choice, so that names remain names, and no one's life is ever reduced to a line in a ledger again. His image became the very definition of tyranny. His name invoked whenever people sought to describe extreme wrongdoing. And this transformation into symbol was itself part of history, for while he had once commanded armies and millions of followers, now he existed only in memory, in trial transcripts, in photographs, in films of destruction. His speeches replayed not as inspiration but as warnings. And so the man who had built his power on propaganda was reduced to a cautionary tale, a reminder of what unchecked hatred can achieve. In Germany, the process of confronting his legacy was long and painful. Denazification efforts sought to root out ideology, but millions had once supported him. Millions had participated in the structures of his regime, and so silence, denial, and slow acknowledgement unfolded side by side. Younger generations asked their parents what role they had played. Survivors told their stories, and the memory of Hitler became intertwined with the necessity of remembrance. Memorials rising where camps once stood, museums opening to educate, laws passed to ban the symbols of his party. And yet, even in rejection, his presence shaped identity. For modern Germany was built upon the vow never again, a vow that gave his shadow its enduring place. Beyond Germany, his legacy rippled outward. In Israel, the memory of Nazi-era persecution of Jews became central to national consciousness. In Europe, his name became the measure of horror. In the wider world, his biography was studied as an example of how democracies fall, how charisma can be weaponized, how myths can devour truth. And while some fringe voices sought to deny or distort his wrongdoing, the weight of evidence was overwhelming. The ruins of camps, the testimonies of survivors, the documents signed in his own hand, all proving that his reign had been not a vision of greatness, but a machinery of destruction, and the symbol of Hitler hardened into something universal, a warning sign invoked whenever humanity faced new dictators or new dangers. And so his story, when told slowly, calmly, without sensationalism, reveals not only the rise and fall of one man, but the enduring importance of memory. For memory resists silence. Memory keeps truth alive. Memory prevents the rewriting of history by those who might wish to soften or excuse. And Hitler's biography is perhaps the clearest example of why remembrance matters, why names must be spoken, why history must be carried carefully. For his life shows the danger of forgetting, the peril of indifference, and the price of obedience without question. A price paid in millions of lives. A price that echoes still in the quiet of our nights. As the world moved into the second half of the 20th century, the image of Adolf Hitler did not fade. Instead, it hardened into an emblem of warning. Invoked in classrooms, in politics, in culture, his life dissected in books, films, and documentaries, always returning to the question of how one man, so ordinary in beginnings, could lead a modern nation into such devastation. And the answer was never simple. It was not only his speeches or his propaganda, not only the fear he exploited or the resentments he inflamed, but the willingness of millions to follow, the obedience of bureaucrats, the silence of neighbors, the complicity of those who chose to look away. And so his biography became not just the story of one dictator, but a mirror held up to humanity, showing what can happen when democracy weakens, when hate is left unchecked, when ambition is mistaken for destiny. In the post-war world, his name became shorthand for the gravest harm. Politicians of every side warning against the return of another Hitler, historians mapping the steps that led from fragile democracy to dictatorship, psychologists probing the nature of his charisma, and survivors recounting their memories so that his actions would never be erased. Each testimony another thread in the tapestry of remembrance, and this remembrance itself became a weapon against forgetting, for denial rose in some corners, voices that sought to minimize or distort. Yet the weight of evidence was undeniable. And Hitler's biography stood as proof. His writings, his orders, his speeches preserved, his abuses documented, his ruin visible in the very ruins of Berlin. And across the continent he had scarred, culturally too, his image persisted. Novels, plays, films grappling with his presence, sometimes depicting him directly, sometimes using him as symbol, and in every portrayal he was a reminder of extremes. A figure who embodied destruction yet who also revealed the vulnerabilities of society, the ease with which myths can capture minds, the fragility of truth when drowned by repetition. And so in classrooms across the world, children learned his name not to admire but to understand, not to celebrate but to guard against repetition. His biography transformed from the story of a single life into a lesson taught endlessly, slowly, genera. Story became in time also a strange kind of service, not by his intention but by the determination of those who remembered for his life, studied and retold, became a warning carved into history itself, reminding each generation that no nation, however modern, however cultured, is immune to collapse into cruelty when silence is allowed, when hatred is normalized, when ambition is unchecked. And thus the biography of Adolf Hitler, spoken now in calm tones as you rest, is not only a history but a guardrail, a light in darkness, ensuring that the path once taken into horror is never walked again. In the decades after the war, the world entered an age of remembrance, where Adolf Hitler's name became a permanent fixture not of admiration but of warning, and governments, educators, and survivors alike understood that forgetting would be the most dangerous act of all. So museums were built upon the ruins of camps, archives collected testimonies, films recorded the faces of those who endured, and through these acts, his biography was kept alive not to honor, but to guard against repetition. His speeches replayed not as inspiration, but as evidence. His writings studied not as philosophy, but as pathology. And in this way, he was transformed into a symbol of how fragile civilization can be when trust collapses and hatred is permitted to reign. In Germany itself, the culture of remembrance took root slowly, at first resisted by silence and denial, but gradually growing through the voices of a new generation that demanded to know what their parents and grandparents had done. Monuments rose in Berlin and across the land, stones placed in sidewalks with the names of murdered families, memorials of steel and stone declaring that the crimes would not be erased. And in these acts, the legacy of Hitler was inverted. His name no longer a call to obedience, but a reminder of where obedience can lead. A lesson carved not only into textbooks, but into the very streets of everyday life, so that walking to work or to school, one might stumble upon memory and be reminded that history lives among us. Internationally, his biography shaped politics as leaders invoked his example to warn against tyranny, to resist authoritarianism, to rally democracies to vigilance. And though the Cold War divided East and West, both sides used his name as symbol, proof of the dangers of unchecked dictatorship, justification for alliances and vigilance. And in popular culture too, his figure became shorthand for evil, appearing in novels, in cinema, in satire, his mustache and gestures recognizable instantly, carrying with them the memory of destruction. And while some depictions trivialized, most reminded audiences of the extremity of his crimes, ensuring that his image could never escape the association with ruin. And so, as the 20th century gave way to the 21st, Hitler's biography continued to be spoken not as the story of greatness, but as the story of failure. Failure of democracy to defend itself, failure of society to resist lies, failure of humanity to protect the vulnerable. And this failure, studied carefully, retold slowly, became the paradoxical gift of remembrance. For through his story, humanity built stronger defenses, teaching vigilance, teaching compassion, teaching that obedience must never replace conscience, and that the horrors of his reign are not distant, but possible whenever silence prevails. And this, calmly remembered tonight, is why his biography is still told, Why the voice of history continues to repeat his name, not to elevate him, but to remind the living what must never be allowed to return. As the world moved deeper into the 21st century, the image of Adolf Hitler became fixed not only in history books, but in the collective imagination of humanity. His name, a universal shorthand for evil, invoked whenever societies debated the dangers of extremism, whenever leaders warned against authoritarianism, whenever people needed an example of how far hatred and lies can take a nation. And though decades had passed since his death, the shadow remained vivid, kept alive by memory, by culture, by the duty of remembrance. His speeches preserved as echoes of danger, his crimes documented as evidence, his biography retold endlessly, not because of admiration, but because of warning, for his life was transformed into a boundary marker, a red line drawn across history that must never be crossed again. In culture, he appeared again and again, sometimes as a figure of horror in films and documentaries, sometimes as satire in attempts to strip him of grandeur, but always as a reminder that his presence could never be neutral, his name never spoken without weight. And so even in art, he functioned as a warning, a symbol that evil can emerge clothed in ceremony, that tyranny can grow from ordinary beginnings, that the collapse of morality can be hidden beneath parades and speeches. And this artistic repetition was itself an act of education, keeping his memory alive in forms that reached new generations who had never known the war yet, who could still learn its lessons through image and story. Politically, too, his name endured, used by leaders to caution against policies of division, used by activists to remind societies of the cost of silence, used by historians to teach the fragility of democracy, and in this way his biography became less the story of one man and more the collective tool of vigilance, an enduring reminder that cruelty unchecked can overwhelm nations, that ambition without conscience can destroy civilizations, and that the safeguards of freedom are never permanent but must be renewed by each generation. For the lesson of Hitler is that collapse can happen quickly, more quickly than anyone imagines, and the only protection is memory, conscience, and courage. And so, as this story drifts to its close, we see that Adolf Hitler's biography, spoken tonight in calm tones, is not told to celebrate or to excuse, but to remember and to guard, for he began as a child in Austria dreaming of art and ended as the architect of devastation, and the arc of that life remains the clearest warning history can offer. A story of how ordinary ambition twisted into catastrophic harm, a story of how silence enabled repression, a story of how myths devoured truth, and by retelling it slowly, by holding it gently in memory, we honor not him, but the millions who suffered because of him. We ensure that their voices outlast his, and we let the lesson echo softly through the night, that hatred must never again be allowed to rule, that the harms of his reign must remain forever in history, never in the present. By the time the guns had fallen silent and the ruins of Europe still smoldered, Adolf Hitler was no longer a living presence, but his shadow stretched across the landscape like a stain. And in the years that followed, the world struggled not only to rebuild cities and nations, but also to rebuild conscience, to understand how one man and one movement had dragged millions into destruction, and the answer required not only trials and laws, but memory, the careful work of telling and retelling what had happened. And so Hitler's biography entered a new phase, no longer the account of battles and speeches, but the account of aftermath, of legacy, of how his name became an enduring symbol of extreme wrongdoing, how his life was dissected endlessly, not for glory, but for warning. His story used as barrier against repetition, his presence invoked whenever societies feared the rise of brutal rule again. In Germany, the reckoning was especially deep, for though the Nazi regime had collapsed, its echoes persisted. Survivors living alongside those who had once cheered parades, families haunted by silence, ruins standing as monuments to failure, and the question of guilt weighed heavily, some insisting they had known nothing, others admitting complicity, younger generations demanding answers from parents and teachers, And in this tension, Hitler's name became both taboo and inescapable, a figure everyone wished to forget yet could never escape. And so Germany began the slow, painful work of remembrance. Museums rising, memorials built, education reoriented to ensure that never again would obedience blind conscience. And in this effort, Hitler's biography became not celebration but condemnation, a living warning, embedded into the national identity. Internationally, his presence was felt differently. In Israel, his name was carved into the foundation of memory, the Nazi-era persecution of Jews, shaping the soul of a new state, his crimes remembered not only in mourning, but in the determination to resist oppression forever. In Europe, his biography became a universal warning taught in classrooms. In America, his figure used to remind citizens of the cost of authoritarianism, and globally his image became shorthand for the worst possibilities of human nature. The reminder that cruelty can wear the mask of order, that destruction can be hidden within speeches of pride. And thus, his life was told again and again in books, films, classrooms, each repetition a defense against forgetting. And yet in this repetition there was always danger, the danger that overuse could dull the lesson, that invoking his name casually could strip it of weight. And so historians and survivors urge that his biography be told with care, with seriousness, with patience, for it was not merely the tale of a dictator but the mirror of society itself, the reminder that he rose not alone but with the consent of millions, with the silence of neighbors, with the complicity of structures. And so the hard truth is that his story is also humanity's story, a story of weakness, of fear, of ambition unchecked. And telling it calmly at night is not only an act of education, but an act of vigilance, a way to keep truth awake, even as listeners drift to sleep. In the decades that followed the defeat of Nazi Germany, the figure of Adolf, continuing presence in political thought, for leaders across the world used his biography as the starkest example of what could happen when power was unchecked, when fear was used as a tool, when hatred was given legitimacy. And thus his name was spoken in parliaments, in debates, in speeches across continents, always as symbol of warning, never as model. And this constant invocation ensured that his life, though ended in a bunker, echoed across generations. Each new crisis measured against the shadow of his authoritarian rule, each new authoritarian movement compared to his path, so that his biography became not only history but metaphor, shorthand for danger, invoked whenever democracy trembled. In Germany, remembrance became institutional, woven into law and culture. Schools required to teach the Nazi-era persecution of Jews, monuments rising in cities, ceremonies held each year to honor victims, and in these rituals Hitler's presence was inverted, his ambition for immortality transformed into immortality of warning, a life that endured not in admiration but in condemnation. His name preserved not on statues but in lessons of vigilance, and this inversion itself was part of history's justice, for though he sought glory, he achieved infamy. Though he wanted reverence, he became revulsion. Though he imagined his regime eternal, it lasted 12 years, and his memory became eternal shame. Across the wider world, his biography seeped into culture, novels written to explore his psychology, films produced to depict his rise and fall, plays staged to mock or condemn, and in every art form his figure reminded audiences of fragility, of the ease with which cruelty can cloak itself in ceremony. And these portrayals, whether serious or satirical, kept the memory alive, ensuring that generations born long after his death could still understand the weight of his story, still see in his gestures and rhetoric the seeds of destruction, and still recognize the danger whenever new voices tried to resurrect division and hatred. Politically too, his shadow lingered, invoked during the Cold War by both East and West, the Soviets presenting themselves as destroyers of extreme authoritarianism, the Americans warning against tyranny in Europe and beyond, both sides using his biography as proof of the need for vigilance. And though the world was divided by ideology, Hitler's story united them in warning, his life becoming the example of what must never be allowed again, and thus his biography endured not as relic, but as living reminder. A history endlessly repeated, calmly retold, shaping the conscience of a world that knew forgetting would be the greatest danger of all. As the 20th century drew to a close, the image of Adolf Hitler had become firmly set, not just in historical writing, but in the very language of morality, his name invoked whenever people sought to mark the outer boundary of extreme wrongdoing. His biography transformed into a tool of education and remembrance. And yet, even in this fixed position, his presence continued to evolve. For with every passing generation, the memory of those who lived through his time faded, survivors aged, eyewitnesses dwindled, and the task of remembrance shifted from living voice to written word, from testimony to archive, from memory to history. And this transition itself carried risk. The risk that his crimes might be softened, distorted, forgotten. And so historians and educators doubled their efforts, ensuring that each new generation would not only know the dates and events, but also feel the weight of the lesson, the fragility of democracy, the cost of silence, the danger of hatred. Within Germany, the struggle with his legacy remained visible. The country divided for decades by the Cold War, East and West, each shaping their narratives of responsibility, one emphasizing anti-authoritarian resistance, the other stressing democratic rebirth, yet both acknowledging that Hitler's reign had destroyed the moral fabric of a nation, leaving scars that could not be erased by borders or ideologies. And when Germany was reunited in 1990, the work of remembrance became a shared duty, a national identity rebuilt not on glory, but on apology, not on triumph, but on humility. And through this, the image of Hitler remained as a dark counterpoint, the figure against which the new Germany defined itself internationally. His biography was carried into every classroom, every museum, every documentary series, studied not to glorify but to inoculate, his life becoming one of the most written about, one of the most analyzed, a subject of endless debate. For people asked again and again how such a man could rise, how such a movement could capture a nation. And in this endless questioning lay the recognition that his story was not unique to one time or one place, but a possibility, wherever fear outpaces reason, wherever silence outpaces courage, wherever myths outpace truth. And thus the telling of his biography became more than history. It became ritual, an act of global memory, binding humanity to vigilance. And so the end of the century found Hitler not forgotten, but fixed in history as the symbol of destruction, the measure of evil, the warning embedded into culture. His image on book covers, his voice in archives, his ruins visited by travelers, his name whispered in warnings, and this endurance, calm and persistent, is why his biography continues to be told, why his story is still repeated in the quiet of the night. Because history demands it, because forgetting is dangerous, because memory itself is the answer to the question of how to prevent repetition. And so the figure who once sought eternal power achieved instead eternal warning, a life reduced to lesson, a name transformed into symbol, a biography told not to admire but to guard. When the new century began, Adolf Hitler's legacy did not diminish, but seemed to grow heavier, his name spoken in classrooms across the world, his biography appearing in countless new editions, scholars revisiting archives, filmmakers producing fresh documentaries, and each generation retelling the story with its own emphasis, yet always circling back to the same truth, that his life had become the definition of destruction, and that remembering was not optional but necessary. For memory was the shield against repetition, and so his presence remained even in places he had never touched directly. His figure used as a warning in political debates in Asia, in Africa, in the Americas, a universal symbol of what humanity must never allow again. In Germany, the process of remembrance entered a new phase. For the grandchildren of those who had lived under the Reich asked sharper questions, demanding honesty, demanding acknowledgement, and the culture of memory expanded. Memorials grew, education deepened, art and literature continued to confront the shadow. And in this way, Hitler's biography was kept alive not by admiration but by insistence, by the refusal to allow silence, by the recognition that silence itself had once been the soil in which dictatorship grew, and this refusal to be silent became a kind of national strength, an identity rebuilt in opposition to the very man who had tried to define it through hate globally. His name continued to shape understanding of modern politics, invoked whenever authoritarian leaders rose, whenever movements of exclusion gained traction. Comparisons made sometimes too lightly, but always reflecting the same instinct, that Hitler's biography had become the baseline of danger, the clearest example of how democracy can be destroyed from within, how institutions can collapse when myths overpower truth, and though some complained of overuse, the very repetition was proof of the depth of his mark, for his life had become the measure against which all cruelty is weighed. And so the beginning of the 21st century did not erase Adolf Hitler, but instead fixed him more firmly than ever as symbol of warning, a reminder carved into global consciousness. And as this story continues tonight in calm voice, we see that his biography, however dark, continues to serve a purpose, to protect, to teach, to remind that the horrors of his reign were real, that they must never be repeated, and that the telling of his life, slowly, carefully, across generations, is itself an act of resistance against forgetting, against denial, against the very silence that once allowed him to rise. As the 21st century unfolded, the memory of Adolf Hitler became not only a subject of history, but a permanent presence in public discourse, invoked whenever new wars erupted, whenever nationalist movements reappeared, whenever hate speech gained volume. And in these invocations, his biography was retold again, carefully, slowly, as evidence of what happens when anger becomes ideology, and ideology becomes law. And so his story functioned as a mirror held up to modern society, reflecting the fragility of peace, the dangers of silence, the cost of indifference, reminding people that the past is never truly past. It lingers, it returns, it warns. In Germany, remembrance culture deepened further. Students taken on visits to concentration camp memorials. Teachers explaining not only facts but emotions. The silence of rooms where thousands once perished. The weight of Nam, as inscribed on stones. The presence of memory in daily life. And through these acts, Hitler's biography remained alive, not as narrative of power, but as testimony of loss, his name serving as the negative foundation upon which modern Germany built its commitment to democracy, to human rights, to peace. And this inversion, this deliberate turning of his legacy into warning, showed how history itself can be reshaped, how even the darkest life can be used to protect the future. Beyond Germany, his story continued to circulate in films, documentaries, novels, sometimes with new archives discovered, sometimes with testimonies newly recorded, and in each retelling, audiences across continents were reminded that cruelty does not belong only to history, that the mechanisms of propaganda, obedience, and silence can appear anywhere, at any time, if left unchecked. And so his biography became not only the story of one man, but the archetype of tyranny, a case study endlessly revisited because it reveals not only the danger of dictatorship, but also the weakness of human society when truth is abandoned for myth. And politically, his name was used again and again, invoked in debates about international law, about interventions, about the responsibility to protect, about the dangers of populism. And while sometimes the comparisons were exaggerated, the instinct behind them was clear, that Hitler's biography had become the eternal warning light on the road of history, flashing whenever nations drifted too close to the edge, reminding leaders and citizens alike that silence in the face of hate is complicity, that ignoring small cruelties can lead to great ones, that memory must remain sharp, alive, restless, because forgetting is the first step toward repetition. And so his presence endures, not in monuments of admiration, but in rituals of memory, not in celebration, but in caution. And this endurance is why tonight we still speak of him calmly, slowly, not to honor, but to guard, to ensure that his life remains a boundary stone at the edge of civilization, a name that marks the line between humanity and inhumanity, a biography transformed into permanent vigilance. As the 21st century continued, Adolf Hitler's biography became less a story of the past and more a structure of remembrance, a permanent caution carved into the way nations thought about themselves. For whenever leaders sought to expand power beyond law, his name was invoked. Whenever propaganda distorted truth, his speeches were recalled. Whenever minority groups were targeted, the memory of his persecution was raised, and thus his life ended long ago, still influenced decisions, policies, and conversations, functioning not as ghost but as lesson, a lesson retold endlessly because its relevance never diminished, and this endless retelling itself became part of his strange immortality, not the immortality he desired, of glory and empire, but the immortality of condemnation. The permanence of warning in classrooms across Europe and beyond his biography was recited calmly to young generations, not to frighten but to instruct, not to glorify but to protect. Students shown the ruins of camps, the diaries of victims, the propaganda posters that once deceived millions, and by learning these details, they came to understand that history is fragile, that cruelty grows slowly before it erupts suddenly, that the most dangerous tool of all is silence. And so his story taught not only what happened, but how it happened, through complacency, through complicity, through the abandonment of conscience. And this teaching became one of the most important ways his name survived, woven into lessons designed to shape vigilance. Culturally, too, his presence persisted. Biographies published in dozens of languages, films dramatizing his rise and fall, scholars dissecting his psychology, artists interpreting his shadow, and, though some feared that constant repetition risked normalizing, the weight of evidence and the clarity of condemnation ensured that his legacy remained fixed, not admired, but loathed, not softened, but sharpened, so that his name in any context evoked the same recognition, the recognition of evil, of ruin, of the boundary that civilization must never cross again. And so, as the 5th chapter of this story closes, we see Hitler not as the man he once was, but as the symbol he became. A symbol forged not by his will, but by the will of those who survived him, those who remembered, those who refused to let silence swallow the truth. His biography transformed into a fortress of memory standing against the winds of forgetting. And tonight, spoken slowly, gently, it remains what it must always be, a lesson stronger than myth, a reminder heavier than denial, a story told not for him but for us, so that we may rest knowing that vigilance continues, that remembrance endures, that the horrors of his reign are not lost to time, but preserved as guardrails for the living. As the decades move, as the world moved further away from the war, Adolf Hitler's biography shifted again, becoming less about the man himself and more about the structures he represented, the warning signs he embodied, the fragility of societies when myths overpower truth. And in this way, his name served as a constant signal to future generations, a signal flashing quietly in every political debate, in every lesson about democracy, reminding that what happened once could happen again if silence and fear prevail, his life becoming the cautionary tale studied not to understand him alone, but to understand ourselves, our vulnerabilities, our responsibilities, our duty to remain awake even when the temptation of forgetting feels strong. In Germany, the weight of remembrance deepened as survivors passed away, leaving behind testimonies preserved in film, in writing, in archives, and these voices, fragile yet enduring, carried forward the truth that Hitler's atrocities were not abstract but lived, suffered, endured by millions, and each preserved memory added another layer to his biography, ensuring that history could not be rewritten, that denial could not succeed, that silence could not return. for his story was now protected by countless witnesses, even in their absence. And the culture of remembrance ensured that forgetting became impossible, woven into national identity, taught in schools, carved into monuments, embedded in the daily rhythm of a society that had chosen never again. Internationally, his name continued to shape understanding of authoritarianism, invoked in comparisons perhaps too easily at times, yet always carrying weight. For the world understood that Hitler's life was more than history. It was archetype, the embodiment of how fast civilization can collapse when lies replace facts, when fear replaces reason, when obedience replaces conscience. And this archetype traveled across continents, used in classrooms in Asia, in Africa, in the Americas, his story serving as universal caution that cruelty is not confined to one land or one century. It is a human possibility, and remembering his path is the way to guard against repetition. And so, in the calm telling of his biography, we see the paradox of his legacy, that a man who sought glory achieved only infamy, that a leader who dreamed of empire left only ruins, that a figure who longed for admiration became the eternal symbol of condemnation. And this paradox is why his story endures, why it is retold slowly, generation by generation, why tonight it fills the quiet of your room, not to disturb but to remind, not to glorify but to guard, so that memory remains alive, so that the horrors of his reign remain distant, so that in our rest we carry vigilance, and in our vigilance we protect the fragile line between humanity and destruction. As remembrance moved further into the modern age, Adolf Hitler's biography took on an even broader role, not only studied as the collapse of one nation, but as the failure of humanity when conscience is abandoned. His story taught in universities alongside philosophy, politics, and psychology, explored not only through the chronology of war, but through the deeper questions of how ordinary people could follow him, how neighbors could betray neighbors, how silence could permit cruelty to thrive, and in these studies, his life became more than a record of events. It became a mirror, reflecting the weaknesses present in every society, weaknesses that if left unexamined could lead once more to tyranny, and thus his name was preserved, not as relic, but as constant lesson. In Germany, the process of memory was institutionalized further, laws enacted to ban symbols of the Nazi regime, museums expanding exhibits, documentaries aired regularly, and in each case the intention was not to keep wounds open but to prevent denial, to ensure that his crimes remained undeniable, and as younger generations grew up without living witnesses, they were still surrounded by reminders. Stones embedded in sidewalks with the names of victims, plaques on buildings where families were taken, monuments rising in city centers, and these everyday presences made his biography tangible, woven into streets and walls, teaching silently that history is not distant but lives among us, that his crimes were not abstractions but realities suffered in the very places people now walk each day. Internationally, the name of Hitler remained a universal measure of extreme wrongdoing, invoked in debates about new authoritarian leaders, in discussions of systematic mass killing in different parts of the world, in reflections on the dangers of propaganda, and this universality gave his biography a paradoxical endurance, ensuring that even decades after his death, he influenced the way nations perceived threats, the way leaders justified vigilance, the way societies remembered their responsibilities, and though some complained that comparisons were overused, the fact remained that his story had become the which new dangers could be judged. Culturally, too, his presence did not diminish. Books continued to appear, scholars continued to analyze, films continued to explore, some serious, some satirical, but always reminding audiences of his existence, ensuring that no generation could say they had not heard. No citizen could claim ignorance, and this repetition, though wearying at times, was essential, for forgetting would be far more dangerous than fatigue. And so his biography endures, calmly told, quietly studied, deeply remembered, carrying forward the lesson that cruelty, once unleashed, can consume everything, and that vigilance, once abandoned, can allow even the most destructive ambitions to rise again. As the 21st century moved deeper, Adolf Hitler's biography remained fixed in collective memory as the ultimate warning. His life studied not for admiration but for instruction. His crimes revisited not for spectacle but for vigilance. And with each new global crisis, his shadow appeared, invoked in speeches, in classrooms, in debates about democracy, his story proving again and again that the dangers of silence, obedience, and hate are not confined to the past, but remain possibilities in the present. And this universality gave his biography a role beyond history. It became part of moral language itself, a way of naming the extreme boundary of human cruelty, a way of reminding every generation that civilization is fragile and must be defended. In Germany, this vigilance grew stronger as generations turned. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren of those who had lived through the Nazi regime demanding honesty, confronting denial, embracing responsibility, and in this way his biography was woven not only into education, but into identity. The recognition that the crimes of the past could never be erased, but could be remembered, confessed, mourned, and by this remembrance, transformed into a foundation for a better society. And this transformation itself was proof that even the darkest shadow can produce light when memory is preserved and silence rejected. And so Hitler's name, heavy as it was, became the counterweight against which Germany defined its commitment to democracy and human rights. Internationally, his story continued to shape the way nations responded to violence and oppression, invoked when mass atrocities threatened in distant lands, used to justify humanitarian intervention, cited whenever leaders sought to remind people of the cost of complacency. And though history never repeats exactly the same, the memory of Hitler provided a pattern, a framework, a reference point for vigilance, ensuring that his biography would remain not as relic but as living lesson, repeated until its warning became instinct, until societies could recognize, in the smallest gestures, the signs of danger that once led to catastrophe. And so, as the 6th chapter closes, the arc of Adolf Hitler's biography has carried us from his birth in a small Austrian town to the ruins of a war he unleashed, from the silence of complicity to the global echo of remembrance, and now into the present where his story functions as boundary and guardrail, a permanent lesson that hate leads only to ruin, that silence leads only to suffering, and that vigilance is the only answer to the question his life posed. And tonight, spoken slowly, calmly, in the quiet of your room, his biography remains what it must be, not admiration, not fascination, but memory sharpened into vigilance, a lesson stretching across time. As we begin the final chapter of this long biography, the figure of Adolf Hitler stands before us not as living presence but as symbol, a name that time has hardened into warning, a story that has been told again and again across decades, so that forgetting might never take hold. And yet to speak of him now is to recognize that the horror of his reign lies not only in what he did, but in what his story continues to represent. For his life reveals the dangers of obedience without conscience, the peril of silence when truth is threatened, and the fragility of societies that allow myths to outpace facts. And thus his biography, calmly retold tonight, is less about him and more about us. About the lessons carried forward, about the responsibilities of memory, about the vigilance required from generation to generation. In the years after the war, his name became permanent boundary in human thought, the extreme example used in every discussion of tyranny, invoked by leaders and teachers as the clearest sign of what must never be repeated, and his biography was woven into the structure of international law, shaping concepts of crimes against humanity, of systematic mass killing, of the responsibility to protect, all rooted in the recognition of what his regime had done. And so, in this way, his story continued to shape the present, influencing not only memory but policy, not only culture but law. A reminder written into the frameworks that govern nations that vigilance is not optional but required. Within Germany, remembrance became daily life. Stones and sidewalks bearing names of victims, memorials rising in city squares, education ensuring that every child would know, every citizen would remember. And in this culture of memory, Hitler's biography served as negative foundation, his shadow forming the shape against which a democratic identity was built. And this transformation, painful but necessary, revealed how remembrance can reshape society, how the biography of a dictator can become the lesson of a nation, how history, when faced honestly, can become a tool for growth rather than a chain of denial. Internationally, too, his story endured, invoked whenever minorities were threatened, whenever propaganda darkened truth, whenever leaders tried to bend law to ambition. And in each case, the reminder was the same, that Hitler's path began not with war, but with words, not with battles, but with silence, that cruelty grows quietly before it erupts, and that the responsibility to resist lies not only with leaders, but with ordinary people. For his biography reveals how millions made his power possible, how obedience became complicity, and how silence became destruction. And this truth, calmly remembered, is why his name endures, not to glorify, but to guard. As the memory of the Second World War moved further into the past, Adolf Hitler's biography became more than history. It became the fixed language of warning across the globe. His name invoked in classrooms where children learned the cost of silence, in parliaments where leaders debated the fragility of democracy, in literature and art where his figure appeared not as man but as symbol. And this transformation revealed something essential, that though his life ended in ruin, his story continued to shape the conscience of humanity, a reminder that cruelty can appear in modern clothes, that destruction can hide behind the language of order, that tyranny does not always arrive with thunder, but often grows slowly while people look away. And so his biography, told slowly and calmly, became a map of danger, a guide for vigilance. In Germany, remembrance culture remained unshakable, memorials guarded, education constant, museums alive with testimony. And this persistence proved that his shadow could be turned into strength, that a nation could build its democratic identity not in denial, but in acknowledgement, not in forgetting, but in remembering. And this transformation itself showed the paradox of his legacy, that his name, once intended to symbolize greatness, became instead the measure of extreme wrongdoing, his ambition for immortality granted but only through condemnation, his desire for power fulfilled only in warning, a warning so fixed that his biography will never leave the history of humanity. Internationally, his story was not confined to Europe. In Africa, in Asia, in the Americas, his biography taught as part of global history. His name spoken to remind that no nation is immune, that cruelty and dictatorship are not bound to one culture, one land, or one time, that the lessons of his rise and fall are universal, and thus his presence, however dark, became strangely unifying, a common point of vigilance across cultures, a shared recognition that the fragility of conscience belongs to all, and that the defense of humanity must be collective, must be constant, must be awake. And so the calm telling of his life at this late hour brings us to the recognition that Adolf Hitler's biography is not only about one man, but about the structures of obedience, the risks of silence, the dangers of unchecked ambition. His story carried forward so that each generation might look at themselves and see the warning, might remember that history is not distant but alive, that the seeds of cruelty can grow anywhere if forgotten, and that remembrance itself is the act of resistance, the act that denies him victory, the act that transforms his biography into guardrail for the future. To bring this long story to its end, we must recognize that Adolf Hitler's biography cannot be confined to the years of his life, for his presence continues in memory, in culture, in law, and in the conscience of nations, his name surviving not in admiration, but in Condé, for glory but for vigilance. And this transformation is the true legacy, that the man who sought 1,000-year Reich achieved only 12 years of rule and an eternity of warning, his shadow fixed in history as the clearest symbol of how far humanity can fall when hate is embraced and silence becomes complicity. And so the final chapter of his biography is not written in Berlin in 1945, but in every classroom, every memorial, every conversation where his name is spoken as reminder of what must never return in Germany. His shadow became foundation for a new identity. Democracy rebuilt upon rejection of his ideology. Remembrance woven into streets and schools, monuments rising where crimes had been committed, and this commitment to memory became itself a shield, proving that nations can transform horror into humility, that history can be faced rather than denied. And so Hitler's biography became less about him and more about the determination of survivors and descendants to ensure that the truth was never lost, that denial was never allowed, that silence was never permitted again, a legacy of vigilance carved from the ruins he left behind. Internationally, his life continues to shape global conscience. His name invoked in politics, in art, in scholarship, a constant symbol of what unchecked power, unchecked hate, unchecked silence can do. And this universality gives his biography its permanence, making him not only a figure of German history, but a figure of human history. The darkest archetype, the line drawn across time, to remind us all of our responsibility. And though generations will come and go, though survivors will pass into memory, the story remains, the archives endure, the voices echo, and the warning will not fade, because humanity cannot afford for it to fade. And so tonight, as this calm telling draws to a close, we remember Adolf Hitler not to honor, but to guard, not to elevate, but to resist. His biography spoken slowly so that the weight of memory may settle gently, reminding us that vigilance is the true answer, that compassion is the true strength, that silence must never again be allowed to feed cruelty. And in this calm remembrance, we close the book not with peace about him, but with resolve within ourselves. The resolve that his story will never repeat, that his warning will always endure, that history once scarred will never be forgotten. And in this act of memory we find rest, we find vigilance, we find the quiet strength to carry forward the lesson that even in the deepest night humanity can remember, and by remembering, remain awake.